Welcome to RICO 12. My name is Justin, and I am a child of an all-powerful and all-loving God and a recovering addict, and am blessed to be the host of this meeting and podcast. RICO 12 is an organization with the mission of learning and sharing the similarities of addictions of all kinds, and gaining and sharing tools and hope from others who are on this path. We come together from all places, faiths, and backgrounds to gain tools and hope from others who are walking this path. Speakers from our past meetings have represented so many fellowships, addictions, and afflictions, and countries. Today we get a new country, Indonesia, being represented on RICO 12. Excited about that. And we also look forward to continuing to add to the diversity of speakers and backgrounds. Today's speaker for the 192nd meeting is J.M., whose topic is entitled A Slow Walk with God. And we'll get to his talk in the Q&A afterwards here in just a minute. But first, for a little bit of business. The RICO 12 family of recovery resources continues to grow and have more resources for the addict and loved ones of those addicted. I invite you to go and listen to and subscribe to the other RICO 12 podcasts that you can find information about. I'll put it in the chat of the live meeting here, and it'll be in the show notes of the podcast. Go check out those other resources. They're fantastic, and I'm getting a lot of really good feedback on them. On that note, RICO 12 is a self-supporting service, and we appreciate your help in keeping us working our 12th step in this manner. I want to thank a few of our spearheads and donors who have joined the spearhead rank. Thank you to Tracy, Julia, and Santesh for your donations. Those really help in our mission to help to share this message with others. Now, if you out there would like to become a spearhead and support RICO 12 in our mission, please consider going to www.rico12.com/support and making either a one-time donation or becoming a monthly spearhead donor. We look forward each week and each meeting to receiving from the light reflected from our speakers. That light inspires hope, meaning, worth, and growth in us, the listening audience. Now I'm going to introduce our speaker for today, J.M. Now, Jay is from Bali, Indonesia, and has been walking on his path through recovery for the last 25 years. He had a transformative spiritual experience that brought him to the awareness of God at an early age, but then fell into the abyss of addiction in a myriad of forms for decades. When he finally got clean and sober and found his way into the rooms of AA, NA, SLAA, and CODA, he began to grow spiritually. But it wasn't until he hit his third rock bottom and lost everything that he loved that he was surrendered enough to dedicate his life to this journey of recovery. He was fortunate that God put David G. from Oklahoma, who is a previous speaker on RICO 12, into his life right at that moment to show him the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous in a way that he could never have imagined. It was only then that the true promises and miracles of recovery began to manifest and be revealed in his life. Jay, we're excited to hear from you. Take it away. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Justin. I certainly appreciate the service you're doing to the recovery community. It really is amazing, and your work is much appreciated. So my name's Jay. I'm an alcoholic, recovered drug addict, sex addict. I'm an overeater, an under-earner. I've had problems with coffee, with cigarettes, you name it. If it can be abused in some way, I've probably been there and done it at some point in my life. So where my story starts is, I came from a loving home. I had very loving parents. I always felt loved. But, in addition to that, our family was rife with addiction, generational alcoholism, addiction, and abuse in many forms. So it was just the blueprint in which I received about how to cope with life and stress. So, my path through various addictions started early. I think I was stealing cigarettes and smoking in grade school. I got stumbling drunk the first time I drank at about the age of 10. I had to be carried out of the party. It was my parents' party too. I was a daily drug user and drinker by the age of 13, which coincided with my first arrest for stealing a car. We stole one of my friend's parents' cars, and by the time I was 17, I had a pretty good idea that there was a problem. I was getting arrested quite regularly. And at one point, the judge just took everything I did, wrapped it up in a ball, and sent me to juvenile hall for a year. where I didn't use drugs and alcohol. I didn't have any of those. We sniffed a little bit of gas there, but that's about as high as I got. So not being on drugs every day, I got out in 6 months on good behavior. It seemed that when I wasn't drinking and using drugs, I could do okay. But I hadn't learned my lesson. I was only 17. I turned 18. But when I got out, I attempted to go to college, but I got too into the party scene there. And it wasn't long before I was fully back into addiction. And I got arrested once again. I had violated probation and I was facing a mandatory 5-year prison sentence. After 4 months in San Luis Obispo County Jail, my probation officer decided to give me one more chance. And that was the chance I thought I needed. So I kind of straightened myself up. I incorrectly diagnosed that drugs and alcohol were the problem, but I thought they were at the time. So I quit those through college. And that peculiar twist of the brain told me that maybe by the time I graduated from college, I'd be older, more mature, more responsible. I could handle drinking like a gentleman. And that proved to be a failure. It wasn't long before I was back in jail again with the DUI. I was really abusing cocaine and alcohol, and just took it to the limits. Cocaine like fast tracked my alcoholism, and fortunately for me, it kind of brought me to my knees a little bit quicker. But that was one of my horrible rock bottom lows. I wanted to quit and I couldn't. And it was just a really frustrating feeling. I tried and tried and tried. And every day I would vow to not drink, not to use drugs. And by the end of the day, I was back at it again. I just couldn't stop. I had nothing in me that could prevent me from going back out, no matter how many resolves I made. Once I got the DUI, I knew I needed help. I ended up in jail again, and I didn't like that. So I went to all the court-appointed classes, and I also checked myself into an outpatient treatment facility. And while I was in this outpatient treatment facility, there's about a dozen or so other people in there. They all had various different drugs of choice. And at the end of it, to celebrate the end of the program, they all went out and got drunk. They didn't realize that, they couldn't drink. One was like, I'm a biking and I can have a beer every now and then. So I quickly saw I'd been down that road enough times. I knew that wasn't going to work. So I said, look, these treatment programs, these 12-step, it doesn't work. I knew I'd read somewhere a statistic that 12-step recovery had a less than 10% recovery rate. And I thought, you know what? I've got as good a chance of doing this on my own. So I stepped away from the rooms, and I white knuckled through 12 years of sobriety. I went 12 years with no drugs, no alcohol. I don't know how. It wasn't me. It was certainly God was there behind me. And the reason I know that is because, there was a period of time when I was in high school, and my mom moved us out to Wisconsin. I was living in California, and I went to a party. And at that party, I got pretty drunk, and we lived out in the country. So I was walking home one night from that party, and it was a blizzard, and there was no blizzard prior to the party. I was dressed pretty casually and wasn't prepared for a blizzard. And I got about halfway home, and it was the first time in my life I realized I might die. And I was pretty scared, and I was drunk, and I since had seen many news reports where kids didn't make it in those circumstances. And up to that point in my life, I was about 14. I was a staunch atheist. I really believed there was no God. In fact, I used to argue with people against the presence of God. I would say, if there's a God, prove it to me. And no one seemed to ever be able to prove to me that there was a God. And I think God knew that. God knew that I was a hard case and needed proof. So, there was that blizzard and me facing death, and I didn't know what else to do. I had nowhere else to turn. We lived in the country. There were no houses around. No cars had passed me. I was starting to freeze. My hands and fingers were going numb, and I knew that I wasn't going to make it home. And the only thing I could think to do was just land on my knees and say a prayer. And I put my hands together, just as I'd seen people do in churches. And I said a real simple prayer. I said, God, if you're out there, please just get me home safely tonight. And I promise I'll always love you and I'll always believe in you. And then I stood up, And when I stood up, I was like enveloped in this white light. And the first thing I thought is, wow, these prayers are really powerful. I should have started this long ago. Turns out that white light was a car that was coming up behind me. There's the lights to the high the high beams of a car, and I heard a horn honk, beep beep. And I turned around to see two girls that I had just met at that party, and they opened the door and they said, "Get in the car. What are you doing out here? You're going to die." And I jumped in the car and I'm like, "I know you're not going to believe this. I just said this prayer to God and you guys showed up." And these girls looked at each other like, "Man, these guys from California are nuts." But that started my journey towards God. That's where my path, not that long, slow walk with God started. So when I got when I got through that 12 years of sobriety without a program, I know God was there. Like I was always searching and seeking for a higher power. Didn't know what it was. I looked for it in a lot of places. I studied religion in college. I went to lots of different churches. I studied Eastern religions and mysticism. I became a Christian. I joined Hinduism when I married my wife. I mean, I've explored. I've always been a spiritual seeker. And that's what I believe kept me sober. But 12 years into that sobriety, I hit another major bottom. And this bottom looked a lot different than my last bottoms. My last bottoms, I was in jail. Yeah. It's pretty easy to see that as a bottom. But this bottom, it was more of a high bottom. On all outward appearances, my life was going great. I had just married a beautiful woman. We had a young son. I was making more money than I'd ever made living in a foreign country. I built a house cash. I didn't have a mortgage. I didn't have to work that much. Worked whenever I wanted, surfed whenever I wanted. Anyone looking from the outside in would have thought this guy's got a dream life. But inside, I was broken. I was miserable. Something was desperately wrong, and I didn't know what it was. And I needed help. And I didn't know where else to turn. The only place I could think to turn was 12-step recovery. And fortunately for me, they had some meetings here. They had NA and AA. So I just jumped into those meetings and I did what was suggested. I got a sponsor and I worked the steps and I took on service positions and chaired meetings and did whatever I had to do. And while I worked that first set of steps in open AA, I got eyes on the fact that, I had a real problem with sex and love addiction. And then thus started a 12-year journey into that. And I started, attending various different meetings, S fellowships, SA, SAA, SLAA, and just working in those diligently. And, I was doing quite a lot of work in those, but I just wasn't staying sober. I went another 12 years in recovery, not being able to get a handle on sex and love addiction. It proved a different animal than drugs and alcohol and anything else I'd come up against. I just couldn't quit. And then I hit another major rock bottom blow, like 24 years sober from drugs and alcohol, 12 years in the program of recovery, trying to face my sex and love addiction issues. And I got to a point where I was discovered, my addiction was discovered by my wife and son. I was kicked out of the house. My son didn't want to see me or speak to me. I lost my house. I was working dead-end jobs. I was broke. I was just at the bitter end, and I didn't know what else to do or where else to turn. And fortunately, even though I was in active addiction at the time, I was back and forth between these different S fellowships in and out of addiction. And I just kept coming back, fortunately for me. And even while I was in addiction, I continued to make outreach calls to other brothers to try to help them. I don't know. I didn't have much of a message to share except don't do what I'm doing. But I saw one guy just light up. He was an addict like me that just couldn't stay sober for the life of him, even though he was just working like an incredibly diligent program, like double what I was doing. And he couldn't stay sober. And finally I said, why don't you check out SA? That fellowship seems a little more solid than what we were doing in SLAA. And I hear a stronger message of recovery. So he went in there and I kept outreaching with him every day. And then finally, I saw something just shift in him. Like this guy just turned on, and I was like, "What's going on here?" Like his life just turned around. Like in a month's time, I'm like, "What's going on?" And this coincided with me hitting my deepest, darkest rock bottom low in my sex addiction. And he said, "Well, I'm working with a new sponsor," and he introduced me to David G. And I started working with David G, and within a matter of days, just something changed. I started having a spiritual experience unlike anything I'd ever had. And I basically he did the he did the interview process with me as it's outlined in step 12. And he basically went through and kind of got to know me a little bit and asked me if I'd really had enough. And I said, yes, I had. And he said, well, are you willing to go to any length to recover from this? And I said, yes, I am. And he said, well, good. You're the kind of guy I like to work with. I like people that, who've hit a deep rock bottom low, because they're the ones that usually show the most willingness. And he then said, are you working steps 10 and 11? And I said, no, I'm not. Even though I'd already worked the steps before, I wasn't working them on a daily basis. So he put me on to step 10 right away. And, he basically showed me how that is the continuation of all the previous steps carried out on a daily basis. It says in step 4, which is just one short paragraph in the book, how we continue to look for all these character defects as they crop up through the day: selfishness, dishonesty, resentment, fear. We add lust in our fellowship. We have a lot of sex addicts. And these are the things that we discovered in step 4. So we're continuing to take that personal inventory. Once we spot it, we ask God at once to remove it. That's step 6 and 7. We discuss it with someone immediately. That's step 5. We make amends quickly if we've harmed anyone. That's steps 8 and 9. We turn our thoughts to someone we can help. That's step 12. And what I found as I worked this step 10 is that it changed the way I thought, because another one of the things that David explained to me really quickly through this process is that, drugs and alcohol, sex and love, it's not really my problem. My problem is selfish self-centeredness. That we think is the root cause of all our problems. That's what it says. So I had to look at this self, like this self plays this continuous storyline narrative in my brain, and I become associated with that and think that's who I am. And I take actions based on those thoughts, which lead to the devastating consequences of addiction. And then I get stuck in those cycles of addiction. It's a completely selfish act. So what 10 does is, when it catches me lost in that abyss of character defects, I'm feeling lustful, resentful, fearful, selfish, whatever, I immediately turn it towards God through prayer, ask him to remove it, and then share it with another brother. We've got a WhatsApp group where we share it, and then turn my thoughts to someone I can help. So my thinking is I'm going to eventually take actions on whatever it is I'm thinking. And if I'm continuously thinking about this selfish, self-centered actions and character defects, I will eventually take that action. And if I'm turning my thoughts towards helping someone else, sooner or later, I don't actually have to do it. In the book, it says you don't have to help someone else. You have to turn your thoughts to helping someone else. If I'm continually turning my thoughts to someone else, I'm going to sooner or later start helping them. And that's what I experienced. Like it wasn't forced. It wasn't something I had to do. I just naturally came to that. And for the first time in my life, just by the application of steps 10 and 11, I started staying sober on a daily basis. And it was blowing my mind. I'm like, okay, I don't have to make 3 outreach calls a day, call my sponsor every day, do step work every day, do this every day, go to 3 meetings a week. Like I stay sober on this. And then he put me quickly into step 11 and had me do the Upon Awakening. I start my day with prayer. I do the nightly inventory. When I go to bed at night, I review my day. I type it out in an email. I send it to him for accountability. And then, he started reading me through the book. He took me through the doctor's opinion. He showed me how it's a twofold illness. It starts with the obsession of the mind, which leads to the physical craving. Once it's in the body, it triggers that phenomenon of a craving, and I just can't stop. And it doesn't matter what it is. It can be coffee, cigarettes, sex, drugs, alcohol. It's irrelevant. Like when that addiction catches me, and I put it in my body, it's out of my control. I'm beyond human aid. Then he started reading me through Bill's story, told me to put it in the first person, looked at the similarities. in our lineage, because most of us are sex addicts. We replace alcohol and alcoholism with lust and sexaholism. When we got to the Winchester Cathedral story, where Bill talks about that first spiritual experience he had, David revealed one of his first spiritual experience, asked me about mine. And we started making the connection that there's something else there that we're not turning to. And then I saw how, Bill drank when times of good times, when times were bad, it was irrelevant. He was just drinking to drink. He liked the effect, just like I did. Whether it was sex, drugs, alcohol, it's all the same. I saw the progressive nature of the illness in Bill's story, and I could relate that with my own. I could see how the sex addiction had the same symptoms as alcoholism, because I've got them both. And as I related with Bill from the perspective of sex addiction, I really started to have a first step experience and recognize the hopeless nature of this condition. I knew I was beyond human aid. So fortunately, the next chapter, there is a solution. It doesn't say there are many solutions and you should go to lots of meetings and see a therapist and make sure you go to rehab. It says there is a solution. There's one solution. It's the steps as they're outlined in the book. The meetings are great. We need the power of the meetings to support us, but it's the steps that heal us. He basically, when the book was written, by the co-founders and the first 100 members, their intention was to mail that book out to people all around across the country and around the world and show them step by step, line by line, how to recover from alcoholism. I mean, that book is an instruction manual on how to get sober, how to get clean. Then he continued to point out the hopeless nature of the illness and more about alcoholism. David pointed out that there's 3 chapters devoted to step 1, which shows that, it's pretty important. There's no other step in the work that gets that much coverage in the book. Because I've got a peculiar twist of the mind, which once again is self, which keeps trying to convince me that maybe I can find a way to keep drinking or acting out. It tried to convince me that for decades. It just, my addiction just skipped and jumped around from one symptom to another. And then there's 4 stories that demonstrate that, if we don't have a spiritual experience, we're doomed. We got the man of 30, Jim, the jaywalker, Fred. And unfortunately for me, I most identified with the jaywalker, and not just because of his name, but because, I could relate with, continuing to walk in front of cars. I'd been doing that my whole life. And then basically the first 43 pages of the book told us over and over that there was only one solution. It had to be a spiritual solution. So then we get into we agnostics. And then we agnostics, there's basically 3 exercises that David had me do. On page 46, there's a reflection exercise, which basically, where Bill's talking about how he was enchanted by a starlit night, but his attention was caught by something else. And then David had me think of a time where I was captivated by something, and really in the moment. And then something pulled me out and distracted me. And he kind of demonstrated once again that thought is what took me out of that spiritual experience. And that thought, once again, is self. Self shows up in the form of thoughts, feelings, judgments, ideas. And then the second exercise in We Agnostics is the spiritual terms. So it's the first action item in there on page 47. So he had me write down all my previous conception of spiritual terms. I wrote them all out. God, the devil, heaven, hell, Jesus, Buddha, everything I could think of. And then I had to get a good look at what my conceptions were, because whatever they weren't working. And then in exercise 3, the bedevilments, I wrote out how I was having trouble in my personal relations, my finance, how I was a prey to misery and depression, the 9 questions, and I answered them all. And, by this time, the writing was on the wall. I was trying to get a really good look at the unmanageability that addiction had, wrought in my life. It was devastating. It devastated everyone I loved. It had caused harm. It kept me in a painful cycle of addiction for most of my life. And then, in our lineage, we add the powerful people exercise from the S.A. White book for sex addicts to see how our conception of higher power was formed by the influential people in our lives. And then when we agnostic ends, it says, but he comes to all who have honestly sought him. When we drew near to him, he disclosed himself to us. And that's what I discovered. As long as I kept walking and reaching out and seeking God, he slowly would reveal himself to me. And then when we went into how it works, this is where, we get a really good look at self as the director. We're just merely actors being driven by self. It's once again, it says selfishness, self-centeredness, that we think is the root cause of our troubles on page 62. The drugs, the alcohol, the sex, these are just symptoms. These are just symptoms of the underlying illness. So by the time I got to the third step prayer, I was really ready to hand it over. I mean, it was just so blatantly obvious that a life run on self-will with self-directing me was not working. I needed something more. I needed help. So I'd said it many times before, but this time it stuck. Up until that point, I was still wrestling my will back from God. And once I said it honestly, I continued to say it through the remaining body of work. And when you look at that third step prayer, there's no amen on the end of it. That doesn't come until step 7. So what David had me do is continue to say that third step prayer every time I started my step work. When I went into my resentment list, every time I sat down with it, I'd say my third step prayer. If I had to step away from it and come back to it, I'd have to stay in my third step prayer. I was just like a mantra that ran through my mind the whole time I was doing my work. So when I got to the resentments, my 4-step resentments, it says resentments are the number one offender. It destroys more alcoholics than anything else. That's when I discovered these guys really knew me. I had lots of resentments I had resentments for almost everyone I'd ever known. Every institution, every principal I could think of was on that list. I'd already done 2 very thorough 4 steps before, but I still came up with well over 300 names the third time around. In column 2, when I wrote about why I was angry at these people, principals, institutions, I had a really powerful experience. When I looked at why I was angry, I saw about halfway through that list, I started recognizing some similarities. I started noticing, wait a minute here. Everything I'm angry about that I think these people did, there's something in there that, I've done it too. That's me. I'm basically writing about myself. And basically what I saw is I was projecting myself out onto other people and then using that resentment as a means to continue to act out. I was using those resentments to fuel my addiction. And I know I'm coming up to the top of the hour. My goodness gracious, I'm only on step 4. It's hard to encapsulate all this in 25 minutes. But anyway, I looked at the 7 areas of self-esteem, pride, ambition, security, personal relations, sex relations, etc. And then I did the sick man prayer for all those people. That's where, there was a real shift in the sick man prayer. The sick man prayer was so incredibly powerful because what we do is David had me imagine someone I saw in a sick bed. And I remember when my grandmother was in her last days, and I was fortunate enough to go see her. I sat by her bedside and I held her hand in mine and watched her and felt grateful to have that opportunity. And when I got to the sick man prayer, I envisioned every single person on that list in that bed in the place of my grandmother. And I said the sick man prayer for each and every one of them. And boy, when I did that, something really just released. And I saw that list from a whole different perspective. And so when I went to the turnarounds and wrote about my part, it was pretty clear that I had set that ball in motion with my actions, that resentment, that was all mine. And then I don't know how I can encapsulate the rest of this in 2 minutes, but I went back.
No worries, just get where you get.
Okay. And then I got home and did 6 and 7. And at the end of 7, that's where I closed out that prayer with the amen. I looked at my work. I asked myself if I missed anything. I looked at the first 5 steps to make sure they were done thoroughly. I asked myself if I was really willing to let go of these character defects that had held me back all these years. And when I was ready, I honestly said that 7-step prayer, closed it out with an amen. immediately started writing out my 8-step amends list and started cracking to it. And we can pick up, I already told you about 10 and 11. We can crack into 9, and I can tell you a little bit more about 12 when we do the Q&A if you'd like.
Yeah, that'd be perfect. Thank you so much, Jay. I really appreciate you walking through these steps. And I've written down several questions. We've got a couple in from the live audience so far. And a reminder to our live audience, if you have questions for Jay, please post them in the Q&A. I'll get to those as we get along here. But yeah, I'd like to talk a little bit about jumping into step 10 and 11. I mean, you already shared this a little bit. What power, why do you think that was important for you to jump right into 10 and 11, even before you started step 1 in working with David as your sponsor?
Okay. Well, David starts everyone in 10 and 11, regardless of where they are, because, he has found through lots of diligent work over many years that just really works well, especially with sex addicts. And I was proof in the pudding. Like I was quite familiar with the program at that point. I'd been in 12-step recovery for 12 years. I'd already worked a full set of steps in open AA. I worked for 5 years in SLAA alone. And in that 5 years, I only got to step 6. I spent 3 years just on step 4. I couldn't, when I was working through SLAA, I kept slipping. I just kept slipping. It seemed to me at one point, I just came to the realization that it just almost seems like some of these S fellowships are just designed for failure. Like they've got slip questions. It's just the whole way they're set up. It's just like you slip, you come back, you slip, you come back. It's just like this revolving door. I just couldn't stop acting out. I'd get like a week here, a month there. I'd get a couple months. I racked up 6 months a couple times. I got 9 months on one occasion. So when I came to David, I was well familiar with the 12 steps and how they worked, but I was not doing 10 and 11 on a regular basis. And like I said, the 10 steps embodies all the previous steps up to that point, and 12. So it's like, once I started doing that, I don't know how, but through some miracle, just the application of that 10th step kept me sober day at a time. And listen, I was no slouch in the S fellowships. Like I worked the SLAA How program. I was making 3 outreach calls a day. I was calling my sponsor every day. I was going to a minimum of 3 meetings a week. I was doing step work every day. I mean, I was on it. I was doing a lot, and I just would stack up, weeks and months and slip, weeks and months and slip. And I just was like pulling my hair, like, what's wrong? And don't get me wrong. I'm not saying SLAA doesn't work. It works for a lot of people. I've seen people that have amazing recovery. The sponsor I worked with in SLAA was an amazing human being, and it worked for him, but it just did not work for me. So David recognized that, and that's why he starts on 10 and 11. And I think what's most important about starting with 10 and 11 is the whole purpose here is we're trying to have a spiritual experience, right? How can we have a spiritual experience if the mind is consistently focused on self? When that self is running the show and dictating my life and telling me this endless storyline and narrative, I start becoming convinced that that's who I am. And I start taking actions based on that false narrative. Whereas when I go into steps 10 and 11, I'm turning away from that thought life into a prayer life, integrating it into my day on a daily basis from the time I wake up all throughout the day through the 10th step to the time I go to bed with the nightly review. So I'm bookending my day. And whenever any negative emotion or character defect crops up throughout the day, I'm 10th stepping it. And that takes the fuel that was firing my addiction. Like that's the fuel, those resentments, the lust that I experience on a daily basis, the fear, the selfishness, once that stuff accumulates, it's just a matter of time. Before you put a little tinder on it and it lights up and explodes. And that's what I saw in SLAA. And like I said, I spent 3 years just trying to get through a 4-step in SLAA. It was endless. I just kept slipping. It was like a powder keg. And I just, once I did the 10 and 11, boy, I stayed sober a day at a time. I've to get onto the 12 that I missed, I back for the first 12 years of my recovery, I was, up to 24 years clean and sober from drugs and alcohol. But when people would approach me to sponsor them, I'd be like, hey, look, you know what? I'll get you started, but I can't really take you too far because I'm kind of a mess myself. And I'd get them started and just like try to help them find a new sponsor. But boy, once I got this solution and started turning my thoughts towards helping other people, I wanted to help other people. I started looking for opportunities to be of service and to contribute and to help other people, because now I finally felt like I had the solution. Before, I was like scrambling around trying to patch together, a program, and that was self. Self can take control of the program too. Self can manifest and masquerade as a higher power. Self is incredibly cunning. So yeah, once I had this solution, I wanted to share it, and now I work with 4 or 5 guys at any given time, and I start them the same way David started me, and I watch them all stay sober. Guys that could not stay sober in any other fellowship stay sober a day at a time. Starting with 10, 11. I know there's a lot of people that say, hey, the steps should be worked in order, blah, blah, blah. Got lots of reasons and justifications for that. But my experience is that, when I didn't do 10 and 11, I didn't stay sober. When I started with 10 and 11, I did. And that's just my experience. I'm not telling anyone else how to work their program, but that's how I work mine.
Thank you for sharing that. And I appreciate that. That's something that actually David taught me that also. I have not worked the steps with him, but he is one of the people on the Big Book Roundtable, Rico 12 Big Book Roundtable podcast that I've got going. And I'm just learning so much from him. And that's one of the step 10 concept is something that I've taken from him, and I'm applying it with those that I'm working with. It's a beautiful thing. I'm finding a lot of power in that. Mm-hmm. So I want to jump to, I'm going to jump to a step 11 here in a minute, because I want to dig there for a minute. But first, I want to go to a couple of questions from our live audience. And this is something that Roz has said, and I'm going to take 2 questions and kind of bring them together. Roz says, I'm suffering in depression. I'm a dry addict from several addictions, talks about alcohol and food and codependence and love addict and debtor, adult child of alcoholics, just a mess. And Roz says, I'm depressed as all get out everywhere I'm going. Give me hope. What is something that you can share with somebody who, like yourself, is dying in multiple places, but just needs hope and help?
Well, man, I that was Ross, you said?
Yeah, Roz.
Roz, hey Roz, look, I can relate. I've been there. I've felt that. That's a terrible place to be. But the hope is that, like I said, there is a solution. There is a solution. There is a way out. And the pioneers of Alcoholics Anonymous, they put it all in this book. It's all here. It's not just the solution to drugs. It's not just the solution to alcohol. It's the solution to all problems. And like I said before, it's like this book was written to be a blueprint for recovery. Like, they cracked the code when they wrote this book. Like, there was truly a miracle that came into being when this book was written. And one thing my sponsor used to say to me in SLAA, because a lot of people watched me suffer for a long time. They really did. They're just like, yeah, this Jay's hopeless. He's really hopeless. I mean, you watch a guy in recovery for 12 years just not get sober. It's got to be daunting and frustrating. So I know what that feels like. But one of my sponsor in SLAA, he had a lot of wisdom too. I've been really blessed and fortunate to have some amazing men as my sponsors, just selfless people that really work hard to help other people. And he would always say, as long as you keep coming back, there's hope. He's like, we might be powerless over our addiction, right? We're beyond human aid. We are powerless over our addiction. But he said, what we are not powerless over is our ability to work our program. And when we work our program the way it's outlined in the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, because that is the foundational text that sprung all other 12-step programs, when we do that work, we do recover. It's a given. But I'm not gonna lie to you. It's a simple program, but it's not easy. It takes a lot of work. Like, we have to be at a point where we're willing to go to any length. But as long as we keep coming back to this program, there's always hope. It's when we depart. It's when we step off the track and go our own way and just give up and go into the muck and mire of addiction. That's when all hope is gone, right? Because we all know, this affliction ends in jails, institutions, and death. But as long as we keep coming back to this fellowship, there's hope. And when we're really ready for the solution, really willing to go to any length, I mean, it's kind of unfortunate, but sometimes we've got to be in that place before we're really willing to go to any length to do what it takes. And I see a lot of people that just kind of raise their hand, I'd like some recovery. But boy, when you put them on the 10 step and, say, send me these as they crop up through the day and they don't, you're like, well, if you're willing to go to any length, I mean, you should be able to find 2 to 3 minutes in your day to send some 10 steps. Like, this is a program of action. We pray, take action, pray, take action. We need to, like, that depression, that like addiction, like it's all a symptom of self, right? Because when I'm thinking about all my problems, I'm stuck in self. When I'm helping another person, I come out of myself and I start thinking about another person's problem. I start trying to help them solve their problems. It takes me out of my head and into helping others. And like, you don't need to be on step 12 to be helpful to other people. You need to wait till you get to, probably should wait till you get into your amends before you start taking on sponsees, but there's always ways to be helpful. There's like this, there's a lot of suffering with sick people in this world. You're not alone, Roz. There's probably someone that feels worse than you do. Try to help them. When I go to a meeting, I really pay attention and listen. I listen to what's going on in that meeting. And you can hear suffering. I could hear the suffering in that message. I can hear when someone's suffering. When you hear that in the meetings, go up, step up to them, walk up to them after the meeting. Go help them. Go find out what's going on in their life. Just listen. Sometimes that's all it takes, is just to listen.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Jay. I want to jump over to your step 11 stuff. By the way, so much good stuff there. From your first and perhaps your first ever prayer, the one that you said, hey, I hit my knees in the snow, in the blizzard and prayed to God, hey, help me. And you had that white light moment of the headlights. Between that prayer and your prayer life today, what has evolved on this slow walk with God over this time?
Oh, yeah. Being an addict, I'm just I want a quick fix. Yeah. I want instant gratification. I used to just think that you pray and you get, I remember, like I said in my share, like, I've always been a spiritual seeker. Once I had that epiphany white light experience where God's presence just became abundantly clear to me, I wanted to know what it was. I wanted to put a face to a name. And I wanted to see God and know God. I studied God. It was all self. It was all self dictating my spiritual walk. I was trying to comprehend and understand a force and an entity that was beyond human comprehension. What I learned on my walk in recovery is it's not about understanding or comprehending or putting a face to a name or following some specific religion, church, or dogma. It's about going into right relationship with God, for me, without even understanding what that is. My prayer life basically is pretty consistent. Yeah. Like, when I feel the way Roz is describing, and trust me, like, I'm going through a divorce right now. My dad passed away a few months ago. I'm going through a pretty challenging time in my life. Previous to this recovery work, I would have acted out, gone out into, numb that pain of those emotions with drugs, alcohol, sex, love, you name it. But now I turn towards prayer. I turn towards God, because I'm beyond human aid. So I just try to be more diligent in my prayers. And it's like, it doesn't need to be like on your knees all the time, but like, I find that God is everywhere and everything. He's in my head. He's in my body. He's in the world. He's in every person I interact with. If I become sensitive and intuitive enough, I start experiencing God and manifested in many different forms. and it's always there to be interacted with. It doesn't have to just be in prayer. When I'm quiet and present, I can feel it. But yeah, it takes the work of recovery to get to that point. And even now, I sometimes fall off the track, and I'm out of sorts, and the voice goes quiet. I don't hear it. I feel disconnected. It's the work of recovery that gets me to a place where I can be present in that space enough to feel God's presence. And like we always say in these big book step studies, it's like, my sponsor didn't define God. He took my hand and put my hand in the hand of God. It's like I don't understand God, but I have a relationship with God. God interacts with me in the world as I move through the world.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that evolution as it's happened over the last however many years it's been. I appreciate that. We have another question that has come in from our live audience. This is from Marianne. Marianne says, you mentioned that you also identified as a compulsive eater. Can you briefly talk about how you discovered that issue and how you deal with it?
Oh boy, oh boy. Okay. Yeah, goodness gracious. How do I address that? So my addiction has taken so many different forms over the years. Like I started out drugs and alcohol, right? Drugs and alcohol landed me in jail. I thought, I don't want to be in jail. Got to quit drugs and alcohol. Quit drugs and alcohol. And I'm like, oh, geez, I can't stop smoking cigarettes and drinking coffee. And just like everything else, I'd smoke over a pack a day of the strongest cigarettes that had double the tar, double the nicotine. I drank 3, 4, 5 glasses of the biggest coffees I could find until I was shaking. Like, I got to quit coffee and cigarettes. And I quit those. And then it's like, oh, guess what? Now you're a sex and love addict. And so, now I got to deal with that. And the way the cycle and pattern worked for me is like, when I got into SLAA, I realized that I was both a sex and love addict. And what that cycle looked like is in the love addiction, my wife and I would get in these massive fights. We just had these knockdown, blowout fights. And then I would get angry and I would justify going and acting out sexually. And I'd do that. And then I'd feel so much guilt, shame, and remorse for what I had done that I would then try to numb that pain with food. And on the way home, I would stop at McDonald's, and there was a KFC, Kentucky Fried Chicken across the street. And I'd just go over there and I'd do some chicken. And I'm going further up the hill. There's a Circle K, and I'd stop and get some treats at Circle K. And I mean, it was just off the hook. I was so poly addicted, and they were all so intertwined that it was just hard to pin down one of them. Like I said before, they're just all symptoms. They're just all symptoms. And what I found over the years, I had some pretty serious health conditions. I got an autoimmune condition that really knocked me out, and I did a lot of research into that and found that inflammation is one of the leading causes of most diseases and illnesses. So tried to eliminate inflammation from my life, and that was dietary. And I went on 3 different elimination diets, and I purged that, and I was still binging and purging. I'd go on these really strict elimination diets, and I'd go to Jack in the Box, eat a double cheeseburger and a bunch of fries and a milkshake, and then I'd be like, oh, I got to go back to the elimination diet. I just back and forth with that for a while. But as I worked through this process with David, and I really started having this experience. Like I stopped. It was less about my will. Like up until this point, it was all my force of will trying to kind of shoehorn recovery. But once I started having this spiritual experience as I moved through this body of work, like these things were just stripped away and removed. These character defects were removed. And when I went to do the amends process in the US, I was fortunate enough to do that. My amends process corresponded with when I was in America, and I got to go spend some time with my mother, who also has some food issues. And, I got to spend some time with her, and they were just removed. I wanted to set a good example. And, I went out, bought healthy food, and was helping her eat clean. It's like, I didn't have to wrestle with it anymore. It just was removed. Yeah. It was a God thing.
Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that, Jay. Let's go to step 9. We stopped with your process there in your show with step 8. We talked 10, 11, and 12 a little bit. Step 9, what did that look like for you? Why, and you talked about your amends process going over to the States to do it coincided with that to do that. But tell us a little bit about your experience with step 9.
Yeah, step 9 was incredibly powerful. Yeah, so when I did step 9, I had my list, and I was looking at that list. I was thinking, man, there's some people I really don't want to make amends to, and and it just so happened that one of the people that was on that amends, the one of the ones that like probably the person I wanted to do the least, just happened to be in Bali just right as I was starting. And I talked to David. He's like, "You got to do that one." Like, shoot, I was hoping to really save that one for last, but I did. I knuckled up and I went and I did it, and just huge relief. I was like, "Oh my gosh, I'd done amends before, but this time through the process, it was just such an incredibly different experience." It was like each one I did stripped away a layer of debris, and I felt freer and closer to God, and the spiritual experiences started happening so profoundly. And David G's a Native American, and he told me to smudge with sweet sage. So I went out and bought some of that, and looked online to find out what a smudging ceremony looks like, and I tried to do that to the best of my ability. And it's a Native American purification ceremony, and I used that to kind of cleanse as I was going through this amends process, and got to this point. This is kind of crazy, but I got to this point where I was doing an amends for some people that had passed away, and I went out into the backyard and I wrote some letters, and I wrote some letters, and I was going to burn them and say some prayers for those people. And I started a little fire, and I put a little gas first, which turned out to be a huge mistake. And I lit the fire, and boof, this giant fireball. I was all of a sudden immersed in the middle of this fireball that was about 10 feet on all sides. It was another one of my near-death experiences. Like, there was a millisecond in the middle of that fireball where I thought, oh, this is death. I'm dead. And then it's just like it evaporated as soon as it started. And it was just so amazing. I was like, what in the world is that? It's a complicated amends that I was doing. It was someone that had actually put magic on me. I live in Bali, and people here like to put black magic and stuff on other people. And I was doing an amends for someone that had put magic on me that had passed away. And I felt, whoa, there's a spiritual something going on here. And I came back to the house. I smudged it with sweet sage. I prayed. I went to bed that night and had like one of the best nights of sleep I've ever had. I woke up the next morning. I sat down on my meditation rug and started meditating. And I had done this Vipassana meditation before, and I was kind of following this line through the two meridians of my body and the hemispheres of my body, and all of a sudden I just felt like I just felt and saw in my mind's eye that I was just like this image of light in a human form, and I was just connected to everything. And it was a very brief instant, but it was incredibly powerful. That was one of the more profound spiritual experiences I had while doing my 9th step. And then, like I said, I went to America, and I got to do events to all my friends and family there. I was fortunate that I got to see almost everyone. And I was really, really grateful that I got to see my father, because my father was a late stage chronic alcoholic. Fortunately for me, he was the one who had introduced me to the program of recovery. He used to take me to meetings when I was a kid, when he was in AA, but he fell out and ended up back on prescription medication, and ended up doing 12 years in prison, and got out and just couldn't get his life back together, continued using prescription medication, and eventually started drinking again. And his last 5 years, he was drinking alcoholically, and still convinced that trying to convince me that he wasn't an alcoholic, that he could responsibly drink a few beers every once in a while. And I was sitting there watching him chug a 12-pack, and I got to spend some quality time with him, and I got to do an amends with him. We got to share some laughs, tell some stories, look at some photos from the past. I got to be there for him and love him, in spite of, the disease that was ravaging him. And then when I got back to Bali, he died a few months later. So I was just so incredibly grateful that I had that opportunity to do that amends with my father. It was just super powerful. And I continued to do living amends with my mother and my soon to be ex-wife and my son and everyone else that I've harmed along the way. The amends process is an ongoing process, but this time around, it was incredibly powerful. Each time I did it, it just like elevated me spiritually. I never experienced anything quite like it.
Mm. Thank you so much, Jay. Any other final words of wisdom before we wrap this up?
Words of wisdom. Yeah, just to kind of speak more to Roz and all those other people out there suffering that might feel like Roz does. Just know that there really is hope. We have the solution. You're here. You're in this room. You're moving towards God or your higher power, however you want to understand it. You're taking those steps, those leaps of faith. You must have some faith or you wouldn't be here. And if you trust your higher power and you do this work, as it's outlined in the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, you will have a transformative spiritual experience that you will be able to carry and share with another person who's suffering like you were. But there is hope, and that hope is you just keep coming back and you be willing to go to any length and you do what is suggested. You find a good sponsor and you work these steps. David G. has put together an incredible workshop called The High Road to a New Freedom. And there he goes through the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous from the preface through the first 164 pages. And he outlines it. And that's basically what I did. And in our fellowship and our lineage, we can help. We can help you. We've all recovered. So, anyone that's out there that needs some hope and needs some help, please reach out. We're here. High Road to a New Freedom, and I'm JM, and I'm sure David G. or anyone that works with him would be happy to help you. So please reach out to us because there really is hope. There is a solution.
Thank you, Jay. And I did put the link to High Road to a New Freedom link tree there in the chat here. I'll make sure it's in the show notes of the podcast. Go check it out. There's some really cool resources and stuff in that link and people that you can connect with, male and female. Awesome people there. Thanks again, Jay. That was a great RICO 12 weekly speaker meeting. Those of you here in the audience or out there in the community, if you have questions that you'd like to ask, please consider joining our WhatsApp community by sending an email to rico12pod@gmail.com. You can also send me an email if you'd like to connect with Jay or anybody there, and I can facilitate that. And you can join in our community, ask questions, answer other questions that may come up. If you feel inspired and want to share something of your insights in a 12-step type share, please consider going to the RICO 12 Shares SpeakPipe link and record your 3 to 4 minute share. That link is in the chat here. It's in the show notes of the podcast. And if you've not yet rated and reviewed this podcast in Apple Podcasts, please go do so now. It's a great way to help us work our 12th step and sharing this message with others. Next week, we will have Rochelle J., who will be speaking to us on love addiction. I'm excited to hear from Rochelle's experience, strength, and hope there. And now let's launch off into the rest of our day with the 3rd step prayer that Jay will say for us.
Thank you, Justin. God, I offer myself to thee, to build with me and to do with me as thou wilt. Relieve me of the bondage of self, that I may better do thy will. Take away my difficulties, so that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help of thy power, thy love, and thy way of life. May I do thy will always.
Thank you, Jay. Remember, everybody, there is one who has all power. That one is God. May you find God now. Keep coming back. Let's trudge this road of happy destiny together. Work it. You are worth it.
There was a man put his hand by the side of his mouth, and he wanted to scream, but the sound never came out. the bottle to wash the pain away. 'Cause what he wanted so badly was to live a different way. And all of his problems and all of his pain filled up the puddle and rose with the rain. His ship kept on sinking to the bottom of the lake, and he knew for certain that he was just a fake, just a fake. Was a man put his hand by the side of his mouth, and he wanted to share, but only lies ever came out. So he reached for the needle to numb the pain inside, and the truth that he yearned for shriveled up and died. And all of his problems and all of his pain filled up the puddle, rose with the rain. The ship kept on sinking to the bottom of the lake, and he knew for certain that he was just a fake, just a fake. There was a man put his hand by the side of his mouth as he read from the book, only truth spilled out. So he reached for a power to help him through the night. 'Cause what lives in the dark